Please subscribe to the channel to watch the latest videos.
Colorado judge weighs if Trump incited an insurrection, can run again. Denver, a Colorado judge is weighing whether Donald Trump incited an insurrection and is barred from running for president again. During a hearing this week, she has heard about 19th-century constitutional debates, how and when the National Guard is deployed, free speech rights, and jokes cracked by Trump advisors about the January 6, 2021, attack on the U.S. Capitol. The case, one of many challenging Trump's ability to serve under an 1868 provision of the Constitution, stands out because the judge overseeing it is holding an unusual week-long trial to help make up her mind. She has heard from constitutional scholars, police officers who were assaulted on January 6, members of Congress and Trump advisors who met with the outgoing president days before the riot. The hearing is expected to conclude Friday, and Denver District Judge Sarah B. Wallace is expected to rule this month, as cases in other states move along briskly. On Monday, Trump filed a lawsuit in Michigan after a judge declined to let him intervene in a case seeking to prevent him from appearing on the ballot there. On Wednesday, a federal judge threw out a challenge in New Hampshire. And on Thursday, the Minnesota Supreme Court heard arguments over his ability to run there. All of the cases center on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bans people from holding office if they engaged in an insurrection after swearing an oath to the Constitution. It was ratified 3 years after the Civil War ended to prevent Confederates from holding office. The lawsuits argue that Trump incited armed supporters to attack the Capitol to prevent Congress from certifying Joe Biden's victory. Trump's attorneys contended he did not inspire or participate in an insurrection, and they summoned his former advisors to the stand to testify. Trump wanted 10,000 or more National Guard members in Washington on January 6 to guarantee the protest was peaceful. Kash Patel, who served as Chief of Staff to Acting Defense Secretary Christopher C. Miller, testified Wednesday that Trump authorized 10,000 to 20,000 National Guard members to assist law enforcement days before the January 6 attack. About 340 were deployed that day to assist with traffic control and other minor tasks, but more weren't sent because local authorities did not ask for further assistance, Patel testified. Absent those requests, we were under the advisement of our legal offices, counsels that we could not activate the National Guard, Patel said. His comments were at odds with testimony a day earlier from Syracuse University law professor William Banks, an expert on national security and counterterrorism. Banks testified that Trump as president had broad powers to send the D.C. National Guard, FBI, Secret Service, Department of Homeland Security and other law enforcement agencies to the Capitol to help quell the violence without authorization from anyone else. He would need no request or permission from anyone else, Banks said of Trump's ability to send the D.C. National Guard. Banks said there was nothing in the public record showing Trump had authorized thousands of National Guard troops. He noted the president commands the D.C. National Guard and said he should have deployed troops by early afternoon, as soon as he learned of the violence at the Capitol. Trump did not act for hours. Former Trump spokeswoman Katrina Pearson said she was brought in to help with the January 6 rally a few days beforehand because of infighting among the organizers. She said Trump told her at a January 4 meeting that he wanted 10,000 National Guard members present to prevent problems. He goes, "Let's just have 10,000 National Guard and then that way we won't have any problems," she testified. On cross-examination, lawyer Eric Olson displayed a copy of text messages between Pearson and Max L. Miller, who was a Trump aide at the time and was elected to Congress last year. In one message after the Trump meeting, Miller told Pearson that he was just glad we killed the National Guard and a procession. Pearson reacted to the comment with a heart emoji. In another message, Pearson made light of the attack on the Capitol less than 24 hours after it happened by sending Miller a photo of a rioter hauling the lectern for then-House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, California, through a hallway. "You have to admit that seeing Nancy Pelosi's lectern being carried away by a Trump supporter is pretty damn funny," she wrote. Asked on the stand about the message Wednesday, Pearson said, "Yes, it was hysterical." Amy Kramer, chairwoman of Women for America First and one of the organizers of the January 6 rally on the Ellipse, testified Thursday that the crowd that had gathered to hear the president was peaceful and upbeat. She called them patriotic, freedom-loving Americans. "It was just a happy, joyful occasion, and you could see it on people's faces," she testified. Later, lawyers for those bringing the lawsuit showed a video of Trump urging his supporters to march to the Capitol, and some in the crowd soon after yelling, "Invade the Capitol." Kramer said she had never seen the video before and said those who attacked the Capitol were not patriotic. Those bringing the lawsuit have dedicated part of the week to arguing that January 6 qualified as an insurrection. Gerard Magliosa, an Indiana University law professor who has studied the 14th Amendment, cited an 1828 dictionary to show that insurrection was defined at the time as rising against civil or political authority and the open and active opposition of a number of persons to the execution of law in a city or state. Members of Congress in the 1860s believed that a person did not have to take up arms to participate in an insurrection and that speech alone could qualify one as an insurrectionist, he said. Magliosa noted that Congress declined to seat one member because he had written a letter to the editor in support of the Confederacy and another because he had given $100 to his son before he joined the Confederacy. Trump's attorneys called Representative Ken Buck, Republican, Colorado, to the stand Thursday as they sought to show the House's report on the Capitol attack was incomplete. Buck testified that the committee overseeing the investigation did not include all perspectives and didn't explore some aspects of the decision not to deploy more National Guard members. In disparaging the attack on the Capitol, Buck also provided testimony that could prove helpful to those bringing the lawsuit. "I thought what happened on January 6 was obviously bad," Buck testified. "It was a riot in the Capitol building. It was meant to disturb a proceeding." Buck's description of what happened on January 6 resembles the definition of insurrection that Magliosa said was used at the time the 14th Amendment was adopted. Buck took the stand a day after announcing he would not seek re-election in a video that said too many Republican leaders are lying to America. Trump welcomed his departure, calling him weak and ineffective even though he is using his testimony to try to get on the ballot in Colorado. In an interview, Buck said he was testifying to keep Trump on the ballot because I'm a Constitution guy. Peter Simi, an associate professor of sociology at Chapman University who has studied political extremism, testified that Trump's far-right supporters viewed Trump's January 6 speech as a call to violence because he repeatedly said they needed to fight and were at risk of losing their country. During that speech, Trump also said they should peacefully and patriotically protest. Simi said extremists put little stock in that comment, in part because Trump put far more attention on fighting than acting peacefully. In far-right extremist culture, fighting is to be taken literally, he said. Trump attorney Scott Gessler downplayed the use of the word fight, noting that the phrase is commonly used by politicians. He played a montage of Pelosi, Vice President Harris, and other high-profile Democrats telling their supporters to fight. On Thursday, the Minnesota Supreme Court heard arguments in a similar case. Justices asked pointed questions about whether states should be wading into this debate or if this was a question best left for Congress. Throughout the hearing, which lasted about 90 minutes, they noted the 14th Amendment's clause on insurrection does not specifically state whether it applies to the presidency, and they debated what constituted involvement in a rebellion against the Constitution. Chief Justice Natalie E. Hudson said she was concerned about the prospect of creating just chaos if the question is decided differently by various states. You have the potentiality of 50 different states, depending on the nature of the statutes in those states, deciding this question differently, deciding whether states have the right to determine who's eligible for national office, and that concerns me, she said. Ron Fine, an attorney for the voters who brought the lawsuit with the help of the group Free Speech for People, said it was the duty of the court to answer the eligibility question. Nicholas Nelson, a lawyer for Trump, said the question was political, not judicial. In another case, a federal judge on Wednesday threw out a challenge to Trump's candidacy in New Hampshire brought by John Anthony Castro, a self-described long-shot Republican candidate for president who is bringing a slew of lawsuits trying to bounce Trump from the ballot state by state. Judge Joseph N. LaPlante dismissed the New Hampshire case, writing that Castro didn't have the authority to bring the lawsuit because he wasn't actively campaigning for president and has not provided any evidence suggesting that he has voters or contributors in New Hampshire or anywhere else. What's more, the judge ruled that Congress and presidential electors, not courts, are the ones to determine whether candidates are eligible to serve as president. The cases across the country are moving relatively quickly because states will begin holding caucuses and primaries in January. If any state knocks Trump off the ballot, the U.S. Supreme Court is expected to weigh in and resolve the issue for all states. Sanchez reported from Phoenix. Lee and Caldwell in Washington contributed to this report. Hearings begin as Trump critics attempt to kick him off ballots. Lawsuits in Colorado and Minnesota center on the 14th Amendment, which bars those who engage in an insurrection from running for office. In two courtrooms 900 miles apart, judges next week will begin to weigh an unprecedented and historic question: is former President Donald Trump eligible to run for office again given his alleged role in the January 6, 2021, riot at the U.S. Capitol? Starting on Monday in Denver, a week-long hearing featuring witnesses and legal scholars will explore whether January 6 qualified as an insurrection, which could bar Trump from the ballot in Colorado. On Thursday, the Minnesota Supreme Court will hear arguments about whether an obscure part of the Constitution might keep Trump off the ballot there. In coming weeks, courts around the country might hold similar proceedings. The legal strategy, pursued by an unusual mix of conservatives and liberals, is unlike any tried before against a candidate for president. Legal experts are deeply divided on the merit of the theory, but even its backers acknowledge they face stiff challenges. The effort hinges on an arcane provision of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which was adopted after the Civil War and is renowned for protecting Americans' civil rights. The amendment's lesser-known Section 3 states that people cannot hold office if they have previously taken an oath to support the Constitution and then engage in an insurrection or provide help to the nation's enemies. It was adopted to prevent former Confederate soldiers from gaining office and using their authority to undermine Reconstruction. Until now, it has been little considered since that era. It comes out of nowhere and moved from being a really off-the-wall possibility to a very serious potential disruption of the presidential contest, said Kurt Lash, a law professor at the University of Richmond who wrote a recent law review article exploring the ambiguities of Section 3. Trump has cast these lawsuits as nonsense and election interference. "This is like a banana republic," Trump told conservative radio host Dan Bongino last month. The debate over interpretations of that section will move into the courtroom on Monday, as the hearing begins in Denver over a lawsuit brought by Republican and independent voters, including a former GOP leader in the Colorado legislature. It's unclear who will testify, but witnesses could include people who saw the attack on the Capitol unfold before them. "A 5-day hearing. I'm a little blown away by this prospect," said Derek Muller, a University of Notre Dame law professor who has closely followed the cases. "Can you imagine this process happening simultaneously in 50 states around the country? It's a wild process to think about." The lawsuits put an unusual wrinkle into a presidential contest that is already unpredictable. Trump is trying to fight off criminal charges in 4 cases, 2 of them centered on his efforts to reverse the 2020 election. The attempts to keep Trump off the ballot have buoyed critics of the former president, but the efforts could blow back on them. Some voters may perceive the lawsuits as political attempts to sideline a candidate who remains popular among Republicans, said Julia Azari, a professor of political science at Marquette University. "It sort of may be likely to replicate the impeachment process in terms of its political dynamics, which is that it looks like you're using a vague provision in the Constitution to do whatever you want," she said. Trump's opponents are planning to file lawsuits across the country but carefully selected where they started. Colorado and Minnesota have laws making it relatively easy to sue over whether a candidate can be on the ballot, and Trump's critics believe they have good odds before those states' Supreme Courts. The Colorado lawsuit argues that Trump should be barred from running for president again because of his actions after losing the 2020 election, including by pressuring state officials to reverse the results and telling armed supporters gathered near the Capitol ahead of the riot to fight like hell. Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election and interfere with the peaceful transfer of power were part of an insurrection against the Constitution of the United States, attorney Mario Nicolás wrote in the lawsuit. By instigating this unprecedented assault on the American constitutional order, Trump violated his oath and disqualified himself under the 14th Amendment from holding public office, including the office of the president. Trump's attorney, former Colorado Secretary of State Scott Gessler, contends in court filings that Trump never engaged in an insurrection, noting he told his supporters to protest peacefully and patriotically. In addition, he argues Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does not apply to the presidency and courts don't have the ability to keep Trump off the ballot. The U.S. Constitution commits to Congress and the Electoral College exclusive power to determine presidential qualifications and whether a candidate can serve as president, he wrote in one filing. Courts cannot decide the issue at the heart of this case. Judge Sarah B. Wallace has not viewed it that way and is planning to hear 36 hours of arguments starting Monday. She is expected to rule by mid-November. The losing side can appeal to the Colorado Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. Legal scholars said if any state bars Trump from running, the U.S. Supreme Court will be sure to take up the matter. Its decision would settle the matter nationwide. I think it would be very good if the Supreme Court would take this at the earliest opportunity, said Josh Blackman, a professor at South Texas College of Law Houston and the co-author of a law review article contending Trump cannot be kept off the ballot under the 14th Amendment. Trump appointed 3 of the 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, but they haven't always ruled his way, including in challenges he and his allies brought over the 2020 election. I don't think anyone should assume the Supreme Court is going to automatically side with Donald Trump, said Ben Clements, the chairman of Free Speech for People, an election reform group assisting with the Minnesota case and one in Michigan. The Minnesota case was brought by a former Secretary of State, a former Minnesota Supreme Court justice, a former co-chairman of a county Republican Party, and others. The state justices in that case must rule on some legal issues soon after Thursday's hearing, but may send the case after that to a lower court judge to develop a complete record. The Colorado residents brought their lawsuit with the assistance of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, a watchdog group that helped win a court order last year that removed a county commissioner in New Mexico from office because of his activities on January 6. The Colorado hearing could mirror that preceding one, which featured a police officer who was crushed by the mob at the Capitol, a freelance photographer who took pictures of the commissioner in the crowd, a law professor and an expert on political violence. Colorado Secretary of State Jenna Griswold, Democrat, the state's top elections official, said she expects to testify about how the state determines when to put candidates on ballots. She said she wants the court to rule on whether she must keep Trump's name off the ballot. The position that we have taken is that Trump has engaged in insurrection, and we would like a court to provide guidance for ballot access in Colorado, she said. Election officials in other states would also prefer to stay out of a political storm and have courts determine whether Trump can be on the ballot, said Michael Waldman, the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. Election officials now already are under extraordinary pressure and are distrusted and caught up in the political crossfire, he said. Many of them are nervous about having this new thing dropped on their laps. In all the cases, courts will have to consider an array of novel questions, some of them mundane and some of them philosophical. Is the president an officer under the United States? If not, Section 3 does not apply to the presidency. Is the president an officer of the United States? If not, the oath Trump took when he served as president doesn't make him subject to Section 3. Did the attack on the Capitol qualify as an insurrection? If it didn't, Trump can get on the ballot. If it was an insurrection, is it one Trump engaged in? If he didn't, he can run again. The number of questions speaks to the obstacles for those who are bringing the lawsuits. They need to succeed on every argument. If Trump prevails on any, he will get to run for office again. While the lawsuit against the New Mexico County Commissioner succeeded last year, others did not. A Georgia judge shot down a lawsuit last year that attempted to keep Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican, off the ballot. The judge found she did not participate in the attack on the Capitol even while finding her rhetoric leading up to it was inflammatory. Alan Rosenstein, an associate law professor at the University of Minnesota who is hosting a virtual conference on the 14th Amendment on Monday, said he considers Trump a threat to democracy but is not sure he should be prevented from running. It's just not clear if America would remain a liberal democracy after a second Trump presidency, he said. On the other hand, you have the possibility of taking the front-runner of a major political party out of the race in a way that is, at least in the short term, anti-democratic, and who knows what in the long term it will create. Who knows if taking Trump off the ballot will solve the problem of Trump or inflame it even further. It's very unclear how Trump critics hope to use the 14th Amendment to kick him off ballots. Courts around the country are beginning to consider challenges to former President Donald Trump's ability to run for office again. Here's a look at how they are playing out. What's the legal argument for keeping Trump off the ballot under the 14th Amendment? The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, includes a provision meant to keep those who sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War from serving in office. Specifically, Section 3 states if someone took an oath to support the Constitution and then participated in an insurrection, he or she cannot hold certain offices. Trump's opponents have seized on that part of the Constitution with lawsuits that contend he cannot run again because of his efforts to overturn the 2020 election and his role in the January 6, 2021, attack on the U.S. Capitol. Where are the cases happening? Lawsuits are being filed across the country, and the initial attention is on ones in Colorado and Minnesota because they are moving the fastest. A judge in Denver started a 5-day hearing on Monday, and the Minnesota Supreme Court is expected to hold arguments later this week. The Colorado judge is expected to rule by mid-November. The Minnesota court is required to issue a ruling as soon as possible under state law but could send the case to a lower court judge to develop a fuller record before issuing a final decision. Who is involved? The legal theory that Trump cannot run is backed by an unusual mix of conservatives and liberals. Voters are bringing lawsuits with the assistance of watchdog groups like Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington and Free Speech for People. In most cases, the suits are being filed against election officials because they are the ones responsible for deciding who appears on ballots. Election officials in many cases have tried to stay out of the fray and asked courts to decide the matter without taking a stance on whether Trump can run. Trump and branches of the Republican Party have intervened in some of the cases. What is the timeline? The lawsuits must move quickly because election season is approaching, with Iowa's caucuses scheduled for January 15. Many courts may rule after then, but the cases become more politically complicated as more caucuses and primaries are held through the spring. The Republican National Convention begins July 15, and all sides hope to have the issue resolved well before then. What happens after the initial rulings? The Minnesota case started in the state Supreme Court, and the cases in other states are expected to eventually get to their high courts. Rulings by state Supreme Courts can be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court can take cases if it wants, but is not required to do so. Will the U.S. Supreme Court get involved? Legal scholars say the U.S. Supreme Court is unlikely to take up cases if the states let Trump remain on the ballot. The High Court will almost certainly get involved if any state prevents Trump from getting on the ballot, they say. Has this issue come up before? Section 3 has gotten little consideration since the era just after the Civil War, until recently. Last year, Section 3 lawsuits against Representatives Madison Cawthorn, Republican, North Carolina, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican, Georgia, failed to keep them off the ballot. Cawthorn went on to lose his primary. Greene continues to serve in Congress. But a judge in New Mexico last year removed a county commissioner from office after the official was found guilty of a misdemeanor for trespassing on the Capitol grounds on January 6. The state judge determined Couey Griffin, an Otero County commissioner and the founder of Cowboys for Trump, could no longer serve in his position as a county official because he had violated Section 3. It was the first such ruling since 1869, according to those who brought the lawsuit. What are the arguments against Trump? Courts will be scrutinizing the words and history of Section 3, which in full states, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States, or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath, as a member of Congress, or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. To kick Trump off the ballot, those bringing the lawsuits need to prove Trump meets every aspect of the section. That gives Trump and his backers many arguments against the legal theory. Some of them are below. Section 3 prevents some people from holding office, but does it prevent them from running? Section 3 does not say anything about running for office, and Trump supporters argue election officials and judges can't prevent him from getting his name on the ballot. If he wins, it will be up to Congress to confirm he can serve, they say. Does Section 3 apply to the presidency? Section 3 says it applies to senators, representatives, presidential electors, state offices, and federal offices under the United States, the last one being the only one that possibly applies to the presidency. Trump's backers argue those offices are for military officers and postmasters, not presidents. Those bringing the lawsuits say the presidency is clearly an office under the United States. Did January 6 amount to an insurrection? Trump's opponents say Trump cannot serve in office because he fostered an insurrection, failed to put it down quickly, and cheered on the Capitol rioters. Trump's backers say the attack on the Capitol was not an insurrection, noting he has not been criminally charged with insurrection and was acquitted by the Senate after he was impeached by the House for inciting an insurrection. They argue that even if it was an insurrection, it was not one Trump engaged in because he wasn't at the Capitol at the time. Should Congress decide the issue instead of judges? Trump's supporters say Congress is the body that should determine who is fit to be president, not judges. They note Section 3 gives Congress the ability, with a 2/3 vote, to find an insurrectionist eligible for the presidency. Courts can't block Trump from running because Congress could vote in the future to stipulate that he can serve, they argue. Can Section 3 be applied on its own? Trump's supporters say Section 3 is not self-executing, meaning it cannot be used unless there is a federal law implementing it that spells out how and when it is applies. There is no such law, so there is no way to deploy the section, they argue. Trump's critics say Section 3 is clear and can be used either on its own terms or through state laws that give election officials and courts the power to determine who can be on a ballot. Police officers recalled January 6 at Colorado hearing to kick Trump off ballot. Denver, at a historic hearing Monday, attorneys for a group of voters argued that former President Donald Trump should not appear on Colorado ballots next year because, they contend, he fomented an insurrection and is barred by the U.S. Constitution from running again. Trump's attorneys disputed those claims and said voters, not judges, should decide whether he deserves another term. The first day of the hearing, which is expected to last a week, featured an exhaustive retelling of what happened at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, by a Democratic lawmaker who had to evacuate and 2 police officers who tried to stop the rioters. Both officers said they feared for their lives, and one described the assault on the Capitol as a terrorist attack. The case is part of an interlocking set of legal challenges across the country seeking to remove Trump from the ballot under a section of the Constitution's 14th Amendment that was meant to ensure supporters of the Confederacy did not gain office after the Civil War. The efforts have divided legal scholars on whether the provision can be invoked against Trump, but most acknowledge that these challenges are unlikely to succeed. This was an insurrection that Trump led, attorney Eric Olson said in his opening statement. As we've seen, he summoned and organized the mob. He gave the mob a common purpose, to disrupt Vice President Mike Pence's certification of the election. Olson, a former state solicitor general, noted Trump used the word fight 20 times in a speech to supporters ahead of the riot. When his backers got to the Capitol grounds, Trump deployed his Twitter account to further rile them up, Olson said. Trump assisted them by holding off on sending help to put down the riot, he argued. Trump attorney Scott Gessler in his opening statement rejected the idea that Trump engaged in an insurrection, noting that in the same speech, Trump told his supporters to behave peacefully. Frankly, President Trump didn't engage, Gessler said. He didn't carry a pitchfork to the Capitol grounds. He didn't lead a charge. He didn't get into a fistfight with legislators. He didn't goad President Biden into going out back and having a fight. He gave a speech in which he asked people to peacefully and patriotically go to the Capitol to protest. Kicking Trump off the ballot would be anti-democratic, he said. Gessler, a former Colorado Secretary of State, told the judge to employ the rule of democracy by letting Trump's name appear on the ballot and having voters decide whether he should get to serve as president again. First on the stand was Daniel Hodges, a D.C. police officer. An attorney played footage of chaotic scenes from Hodges's body camera that included people attempting to yank his riot baton away from him and crowd members accusing him of betraying his duties by trying to keep them out of the Capitol. After each clip, Hodges detailed what had happened to him, saying that in one scuffle, a man grabbed his face and used his thumb to try to gouge his eye out. In other footage, Hodges and other officers tried to hold back a throng of people that was forcing its way through a Capitol tunnel. With the help of shields they had taken from officers, rioters pinned Hodges against a door frame, and someone ripped his gas mask off. The crowd heaved forward, crushing Hodges against the door as he howled in pain. "I can't remember all the different ways in which I was assaulted," Hodges said on the stand. "I was afraid," he said. "I was afraid for my life and for that of my colleagues. I was afraid for the people in the United States Capitol building. I was afraid for Congress, the Vice President, and what these people would do to them and how it would affect our democracy." Also on the stand was Winston Pingion, who testified that he spent hours in the Capitol in hand-to-hand combat with rioters as a Capitol police officer. At one point, the crowd knocked him to the ground and took his baton, and he feared someone might gain access to his firearm. Pingion said he has post-traumatic stress disorder and left the police agency 9 months after the riot. Representative Eric Swalwell, Democrat, California, testified about the fear he and his colleagues felt when they were evacuated from the House floor as the mob advanced toward them. He and his fellow members of Congress watched Trump's Twitter feed with alarm when he castigated Pence, inflaming his supporters advancing toward the Capitol. "We interpreted it as a target had been painted on the Capitol," Swalwell said. 2 former Trump officials who were slated to testify for those bringing the lawsuit backed out at the last minute, attorneys told the judge Monday. Olivia Troy, a former Homeland Security advisor to Pence, said in an interview that she determined her testimony was not needed given who else was testifying. Ratified in 1868, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to people born or naturalized in the United States and guaranteed civil rights and the protection of the law to all Americans, including those who were formerly enslaved. In addition, its lesser-known Section 3 barred people from holding office if they had sworn an oath to the Constitution and then gone on to engage in an insurrection or aided or comforted the nation's enemies. Trump has dismissed the cases as a form of election interference, and one of his top spokespeople, Jason Miller, was at the courthouse Monday to make the same point. "This is about trying to make the Trump campaign and President Trump spend money to try to distract away from beating Joe Biden in all of the swing states and now even the blue states," Miller told reporters. The voters brought their lawsuit against Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold, Democrat, who as the state's top elections official is responsible for determining whose names appear on the ballots. Griswold has said that she believes Trump engaged in an insurrection but wants the judge to decide whether Trump's name should be on the ballot. Trump and the state Republican Party have intervened in the case. The plaintiffs brought their lawsuit with the assistance of the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, a watchdog group that succeeded in getting a New Mexico County commissioner removed from office last year because of his activities on January 6. Similar lawsuits are being filed around the country, and courts will have to determine in the coming months whether Trump's name can appear on ballots as Republicans hold their primaries. The Minnesota Supreme Court is slated to hear arguments on Thursday over whether Trump can appear on the ballot in that state. The focus Monday was on January 6, but later in the week, Judge Sarah B. Wallace will hear from experts on several issues, including how often the Secretary of State keeps candidates off the ballot, what happens if the country elects someone who is not qualified to be president, and whether Trump's actions on January 6 qualified as engaging in an insurrection. Over the weekend, Trump asked Wallace to step down from the case because she gave $100 last year to a group that was formed after the January 6 attack to vote Republicans out of office and prevent violent insurrections. Trump's attorney argued that Wallace has shown bias toward the idea that January 6 was an insurrection by giving money to the group, the Colorado Turnout Project. The judge began Monday's hearing by saying she would not step aside. Wallace said that she does not recall making the donation and that she was unfamiliar with the group and its mission until she received the motion. "I have formed no opinion whether the events of January 6 constituted an insurrection," she said, or whether intervener Trump engaged in an insurrection. Yvonne Wingate Sanchez contributed to this report. Bootgate and the perils of drafting off Donald Trump. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Republican, probably doesn't enjoy being reminded of it, but his current position and prominence are due in large part to Donald Trump, the man he is failing to supplant as the front-runner for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination. DeSantis's regular Trump-boosting appearances on Fox News are generally credited with the then-president's endorsing then-Rep. DeSantis's bid for the Republican gubernatorial nomination in 2018. DeSantis ran a campaign ad so sycophantic to Trump that year that it made national headlines. That November, he narrowly edged out his Democratic rival and won the governorship. His narrow margin wasn't exceptional. The Republican challenger to incumbent Senator Bill Nelson, Governor Rick Scott, also only barely won. For years later, running a re-election campaign focused heavily on his laissez-faire attitude to the coronavirus pandemic, stoking a sentiment that Trump himself had fostered in the run-up to the 2020 election. DeSantis won re-election by a wide margin. But then, so did Senator Marco Rubio, Republican, Florida. Rubio got 58% of the vote to DeSantis's 59%. Whatever political magic DeSantis believed he had captured was good for about 139,000 more votes than the 4.5 million Rubio got. But DeSantis, unlike Rubio, was a darling of the right-wing conversation. Trump's efforts to retain his office had forced him to withdraw from the spotlight, at first rather sheepishly and then as a function of losing his social media accounts. DeSantis commanded the attention of Fox News and other media outlets by weaving various trendy issues, the fight against woke, mentions of LGBTQ+ relationships, voting restrictions, into policy or executive orders. He became the guy who might defeat Trump, including in his own estimation. It's hard to overstate the importance of that period in 2021 and 2022 when DeSantis was the torchbearer of the Trumpian approach to politics. He himself generally declined to go full bore against his critics and opponents in the Trump manner, but he had a team of folks very eager to do so. And they had a vast pool of angry online commentators willing to direct their fire at suggested enemies, a pool once largely directed by Trump and his operation. Here, too, DeSantis had been handed an advantage by Trump that he put to his own use. You see the problem. Soon after the 2022 election, as DeSantis was basking in his, and Rubio's, success, Trump formalized his bid for the 2024 nomination. Suddenly, he regained relevance and media attention. The creation of Truth Social gave him a way to opine on things, and for others to elevate and share what he was saying. And by the beginning of this year, he was using his platform to attack DeSantis. Those on DeSantis's team thought they owned the online conversation. They soon learned that, to a large extent, they were renting it. And that brings us to the boots. In March, before DeSantis announced his campaign but after he was already losing ground to Trump in national polling, online observers began to notice the governor's predilection for heeled boots. Boots that often had substantial heels. There is plenty of research suggesting that voters prefer taller candidates, and DeSantis's tacking on an inch seemed that it might be a conscious effort to narrow the height gap with the taller Trump. Trump's social media team made boot jokes sporadically over the past few months, hinting that DeSantis was insecure or a phony or, really, once again struggling to measure up to Trump. Then, last month, DeSantis went on Bill Maher's HBO show. He sat in a chair opposite Maher, again sporting boots. A TikTok user clipped part of the appearance and sketched in an approximation of where DeSantis's feet would be, suggesting not only that he was using heels to appear taller but also lifts inside the shoes themselves. That video has 14.3 million views as of writing. In part, that's because DeSantis was asked about it during a podcast interview last week. Host Patrick Bet-David asked DeSantis how tall he was, 5'11", the governor replied, and suggested that he put on normal shoes to answer questions about his height. DeSantis demurred. The video's popularity probably is due in part also to Trump's posting stills from it on Truth Social, where thousands reshared the images. Now it has all blown up into what Trump fans, and others, have dubbed Bootgate. Politico ran a story written by social media menswear celebrity Derek Guy, in which various boot and shoemakers indicated their belief that DeSantis was, in fact, heightening. Late-night TV did its jokes. The Trump team sent out the latest news release in its Kiss of Death series about DeSantis's campaign, suggesting that the governor's shoes are more appropriate for America's Next Top Model than the campaign trail. The unsubtle subtext of femininity here plays into it, too. DeSantis has tried to run as the defender of individual freedom and bulwark against the nanny state. It helped him carve out his own niche in the online conversation among hard-right young men who framed his candidacy as a less malleable iteration of Trump's fringe politics. That's hard to reconcile with a guy who also might be worried that he looks short. But Bootgate is a symptom, not the disease. As the New York Times wrote last month, DeSantis figured that his campaign could outmaneuver Trump online, using his team's experience in social media battles to keep Trump on his heels, so to speak. But that experience was earned on terrain that Trump helped shape and, particularly once DeSantis's bid for the nomination began more obviously to falter, the online conversation turned against him. By this time next year, DeSantis is unlikely to be the Republican nominee for president. He may, instead, be the Florida governor who is eventually remembered for his shoes. Nikki Haley's twisty path to victory. Haley is the new Trump alternative in the race, supplanting Ron DeSantis. Here's where that leaves us. Two things can be true in the Republican presidential primary: 1, that Nikki Haley is the first candidate to supplant Ron DeSantis as the race's Donald Trump alternative; 2, that it's probably for naught that Trump has things sewn up. But what if the second isn't actually the case? Given Haley's momentum in the race, it's worth asking a question we had long asked about DeSantis: can she beat Trump? And if so, how? New polling confirms Haley's upward trajectory. She had previously overtaken DeSantis in New Hampshire and her home state of South Carolina, and a new CNN poll in South Carolina out Tuesday showed her doubling up the Florida governor, 22% to his 11%. That's on the heels of the venerable Iowa poll showing her drawing even with DeSantis for the first time in what will be the contest's earliest state. Despite these developments in Haley's favor, the doubters have come out strong. Trump is still flirting with half of the vote in the early states, they note, with little signs of decline. He's still taking more of the vote than Haley and DeSantis combined in all early states. Trump supporters are more devoted to and enthusiastic about their candidate. What's more, Haley is drawing primarily from a relatively small pot of non-MAGA voters. If either Trump or DeSantis suddenly faded, the data suggest it would accrue to the other man's benefit, rather than to hers. All of that is true. But none of it means, as one recent headline stated flatly, that Haley has no path to nomination. So let's, for argument's sake, look at what that path, however unlikely, could be. As the top challenger, Haley shifts the dynamic. One reason we can't rule this out right now is that the undercard is fluid. We're confronting a dynamic different from what we've seen before in this race, with Haley laying claim to the challenger mantle. This will result in increased scrutiny of her, and voters who perhaps didn't consider her before may give her a fresh look. If the choice now looks more like Trump versus Haley than Trump versus DeSantis, that's a new one for voters. It's more Trump versus a different path, rather than Trump versus a supposedly more electable Trump light. Haley's base of support, at the very least, appears to span more parts of the party. Unlike DeSantis, she hasn't alienated moderate voters. Unlike other candidates who have sought to appeal to the party's mainstream, she hasn't alienated the hardcore MAGA base, at least yet. The Iowa poll shows she's nearly as popular as both Trump and DeSantis there, and she actually holds a slight lead in the suburbs. It's not just one particular group where she's really dug in, Jay and Selzer, who conducts the Iowa poll, told the Des Moines Register. She's digging in across demographics. Who knows whether that new dynamic could pan out differently. Continuing to appeal to both MAGA and the rest of the party has proved difficult for other candidates for a reason. DeSantis never really tried it, though he has certainly proved to be a flawed candidate. But there have been signs that Trump's base isn't quite as committed as it once was. If you're making a highly optimistic case for Haley, you could say that voters haven't really been given a clear choice between different types of candidates and a break from Trumpism, but suddenly they will be. Trump isn't beyond reach in Iowa. The best path for everyone involved is for Trump to have an underwhelming night in Iowa on January 15th. That would seemingly open the door for a legitimate contest. As for whether that could happen, Iowa appears to be Trump's weakest of the early states, at least right now. He's at 43% in the Iowa poll, compared with 16% apiece for Haley and DeSantis. And 2/3 of those Trump supporters say they are committed to backing him, a little more than 1/4 of the electorate. One way to look at that is that Trump supporters are more committed than other candidates' supporters are, and that puts him on the verge of victory. 3 of the past 5 winners of competitive Iowa caucuses have taken less than 30% of the vote. But another is that more commitment is probably to be expected for supporters of a former president, and his level of support isn't prohibitive yet. With nearly three-quarters ostensibly up for grabs and Haley having demonstrated broad appeal, she could keep the race. The problem, as noted above, is that any bleeding of Trump's support would appear more likely to go to DeSantis. But there's a question of whether that will definitely be the case, now that Haley looks like the alternative and DeSantis continues to look wounded. New Hampshire and South Carolina are X factors. At that point, these two states would loom large. The latest quality nonpartisan polling in New Hampshire, from Suffolk University, is a month old. It showed Trump at 49% and Haley at 19%. DeSantis was at 10%. That's an Iowa-esque gap. But perhaps more than any other state, New Hampshire poses unusual dynamics that could help Haley. Its GOP electorate skews more educated, independent and suburban. There's also the fact that it was just confirmed that President Biden won't be on the Democratic primary ballot over a calendar dispute. And some already are trying to persuade would-be Democratic primary voters to cross over to vote against Trump. Oh, and New Hampshire has a bit of a contrarian streak. It often votes for a different candidate than the one Iowa picked. South Carolina comes fourth, on February 24th, after Nevada. Haley would need to stay relevant weeks after the earlier contests, which would be no small task. Her deficit in South Carolina is similar to what it is in Iowa and New Hampshire, if not greater, 53% for Trump to her 22% in the CNN poll this week. But this might be, for obvious reasons, the former South Carolina governor's best shot at an early victory. The CNN poll showed 72% of voters there said they would at least consider Haley, compared with Trump's 80% and 68% for DeSantis. Her problem is similar to what it is in Iowa, in that DeSantis would seem more likely to peel off Trump supporters. While 19% of those who list her as a second choice are backing Trump, 36% of DeSantis's second-choice voters are. At the same time, 60% of Trump backers say they would at least consider Haley, meaning their votes are in play for her, especially if DeSantis can't make it to South Carolina and Trump fades somewhat. A Haley victory or even a strong showing would probably come with significant caveats, given her home state connection. But it would still be a former president struggling in a primary, which right now doesn't seem foreseeable. Haley's best hope would seem to be having the outcome at least in doubt heading into Super Tuesday on March 5, and ideally notching a win. Perhaps at that point, with Trump's first federal criminal trial set to begin the day before Super Tuesday, voters might begin to more earnestly consider something they've shrugged off, electability. The most recent polling shows Haley, once broadly popular as a Trump administration official, running better than other Republicans, including Trump, in the general election. As you can tell, we're straining pretty hard to find a path. It's hardly likely and seemingly pretty implausible. But when it comes to gaming out an actual contest for the GOP nomination, it's what we've got right now. A previous version of this post incorrectly said Donald Trump was polling at 45% in the Republican primary in New Hampshire a month ago. He was polling at 49%. The post has been corrected. Pro-Haley group falsely says DeSantis wanted to fast-track China deals. DeSantis even voted to fast-track Obama's Chinese trade deals. Voiceover in a campaign ad by SFA Fund, a super PAC that backs former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, Republican, released October 26. Haley and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis are tied for a distant second place, behind former President Donald Trump, in the latest NBC News Des Moines Register Mediacom Iowa poll of Republicans in Iowa, whose voters will be the first to weigh in on the presidential race when they have their caucuses January 15. It's been a stunning drop for DeSantis, once seen as Trump's main rival, and a rapid rise for Haley. Now both teams are playing fast and loose with the facts. This Stand for America Super PAC ad starts with a voiceover saying DeSantis can't stop lying about Nikki Haley. There are images of fact checks of a ridiculous claim DeSantis made about Haley, that a vague statement she made about how not all Gaza residents are supporters of Hamas meant she wanted to take in waves of Gaza refugees. We did not get around to vetting that claim, or else we would have given it 4 Pinocchios. PolitiFact said it was false, as did Check Your Fact. David Weigel of Semaphore said DeSantis made it up, which sounds about right. It's fair to call out DeSantis for his statement, which was amplified by his own super PAC, Never Back Down. But then this Haley ad offers its own whopper, that DeSantis voted to fast-track Obama's Chinese trade deals. During the voiceover, the ad displays an image of DeSantis, wearing a face mask, standing behind Barack Obama and Chinese President Xi Jinping. The ad concludes with some tough talk on China by Haley. Communist China won't just lose. Communist China will end up on the ash heap of history, she declares. The facts. The ad sets up the claim about trade deals with this line: DeSantis gave millions to Chinese companies. The citation is a Washington Times article from February 2020 titled Lexmark, Lenovo Tech Funnels Data to China Intelligence Services. The article reported on a study that claimed Chinese-owned technology companies posed a security challenge. What did this have to do with DeSantis? Good question. He's not mentioned in the article. There is a reference to Florida having a contract with Lexmark, one of the companies named in the report. Lexmark, a Kentucky-based printer manufacturer with Chinese investors, said the report was riddled with inaccuracies. But there is no indication DeSantis even awarded the contract. Then the ad makes its claim about DeSantis voting for Obama's trade deals with China. Before being elected governor, DeSantis was a member of the House, so ancient congressional votes are always ripe for mischief in attack ads. This is an especially lame attempt. The ad cites 2 votes in 2015. One, on June 12, was for the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, which was passed to avert a government default. The text of the deal does not mention China nor trade with China. The other vote, on June 18, was the Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities and Accountability Act of 2015. This bill at least has something to do with trade, but the claim in the ad is a real stretch. Essentially, this bill was a vote to extend Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, or in the nomenclature of Congress, allowing a president to fast-track trade legislation. Under the U.S. Constitution, Congress regulates trade with foreign nations, but in recent decades it often has delegated negotiating authority to the executive branch. In the House, the bill passed by a vote of 218 to 208, with 190 Republicans voting for it, so DeSantis was not an outlier in his party. In simple terms, TPA means that if a president negotiates a trade agreement with another country and brings it to Congress for approval, lawmakers have no opportunity to amend the agreement and simply must vote either for it or against it. Why is that necessary? No country is willing to waste years or even months on negotiations to strike a deal with the United States, only to see Congress change the terms later. According to the Congressional Research Service, Congress has sometimes directed an administration to renegotiate certain provisions in a trade agreement before it came up for vote, but ultimately lawmakers have approved every deal submitted under TPA. Preya Samsunder, a spokesperson for Stand for America, flooded us with material to make the case that by voting for TPA, DeSantis was allowing Obama to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That deal, which Donald Trump ultimately rejected, included the United States, Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. So where's China? Samsunder argued that there were indications that China might one day join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. She noted that Obama at one point said China had been putting out feelers about participating at some point. That was basically diplomatic happy talk. The Trans-Pacific deal was designed to counter China. It is absolutely incorrect to say that the TPP is a vote for a Chinese trade deal, said Michael G. Plummer, a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Italy and co-author of a 2012 book on the partnership. In fact, the truth is just the opposite. China was never part of the negotiations. As you suggest, it was an agreement that would have helped the U.S. improve its economic engagement with Asia and would have given it a leg up on China in the region, which is the most dynamic in the world. In any case, the Trans-Pacific Partnership never came up for a vote in Congress before Trump pulled the United States out of it. The enhanced trade authority that DeSantis voted for was used to negotiate agreements with European countries, and Trump used an extension of TPA to negotiate the rewrite of the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico. Samsunder also sent us documents indicating the United States negotiated with China on a variety of trade issues with China after TPA was approved, but we're not sure what the point is. Both countries are among the top export markets for each other, and trade discussions occur frequently, no matter which administration. She did not respond when we asked whether Haley was saying a president should not negotiate any trade deals with China. The Pinocchio test. By any measure, this ad does not pass the laugh test. It makes accusations against DeSantis that turn to dust upon closer inspection. His vote for Trade Promotion Authority in 2015 did not result in the fast-tracking of deals with China. SFA fund earns 4 Pinocchios. 4 Pinocchios. About our rating scale. Send us facts to check by filling out this form. Sign up for the Fact Checker weekly newsletter. The Fact Checker is a verified signatory to the International Fact-Checking Network Code of Principles. Representative Ken Buck to retire from House, cites election denialism by others in GOP. Representative Ken Buck, Republican, Colorado, said Wednesday that he would not seek re-election next year, expressing disappointment that many fellow Republicans continue to push the big lie that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Our nation is on a collision course with reality, and a steadfast commitment to truth, even uncomfortable truths, is the only way forward, Buck said in a video posted to X, formerly known as Twitter. Too many Republican leaders are lying to America. Buck also cited Republicans downplaying the January 6, 2021, insurrection at the Capitol, in which a pro-Trump mob sought to stop the certification of Joe Biden's electoral win, as well as the GOP's claims that the ensuing prosecutions amounted to a weaponization of the justice system. These insidious narratives breed widespread cynicism and erode Americans' confidence in the rule of law, Buck said. It is impossible for the Republican Party to confront our problems and offer a course correction for the future while being obsessively fixated on retribution and vengeance for contrived injustices of the past. Buck's announcement came hours after Representative Kay Granger, Republican, Texas, also said she would not seek re-election next year. Like Buck, Granger was one of the roughly 24 Republicans who opposed Representative Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, for the speakership last month, and who drew criticism from hard-right parts of the Republican base for doing so. The holdouts ultimately forced Jordan to withdraw from the race, and both Buck and Granger later backed House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican, Louisiana, for the leadership position. On Wednesday, in an interview with MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell, Buck hinted that other Republican lawmakers could announce in the near future that they would also be leaving Congress. Buck has indicated for some time that he has been interested in pursuing opportunities outside of Congress, confirming to the New York Post in September that he was interested in positions with CNN, Fox News, or Newsmax. Former President Donald Trump cheered and mocked Buck's decision Wednesday night, deriding the Colorado Republican as someone who knew long ago he could never win against MAGA, a reference to Trump's Make America Great Again campaign slogan. Buck has clashed with the majority of the Republican conference in recent months, notably for opposing his party's launch of an impeachment inquiry into Biden. In a September op-ed for The Washington Post, Buck criticized the inquiry as one that relied on an imagined history. Impeachment is a serious matter and should have a foundation of rock-solid facts, Buck wrote then. Buck was also one of 8 Republican lawmakers who voted with Democrats to oust Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, from the speakership last month. During the Republicans' struggle to elect a new speaker, Buck steadfastly opposed Jordan over his election denialism. Last month, Buck told NBC News that he had received death threats and a notice of eviction from his office in Colorado because his landlord was upset about Buck's vote against Jordan for speaker. Buck said then that he did not blame Jordan but pundits and groups putting out misinformation and hateful information. If we're going to solve difficult problems, we've got to deal with some very unpleasant truths, or lies, and make sure we project to the public what the truth is, Buck told Mitchell on Wednesday. Buck expressed some optimism that Republicans would unite behind very important issues, including funding for Israel and Ukraine, as well as a stopgap funding bill to avoid a government shutdown on November 17. I think there are a lot of major issues that we will unite behind, Buck said. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi defends support for Israel's response to Hamas. She also reiterated her support for a two-state solution and her criticism of the Israeli government's settlement policies. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, California, defended her party's strong support of Israel's counterattack on Hamas on Thursday, pushing back against recent dissent among some of her party's voters and protesters outside her San Francisco home. She said the forceful response by President Biden and most House Democrats should not detract from the other Democratic priorities. The party's leaders remain committed, she argued, to a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, to calling for Israel to abide by the laws of war and to defending the rights of Muslim communities in the United States. Hamas made an assault. Supposing they came into a raid here and killed over 200 people and kidnapped others and killed 1,000 other people going into their homes. This was outrageous. Now, how Israel deals with it in terms of not losing the lives of others in Gaza, they have to honor the rules of war going forward, Pelosi said. For a political purpose, should we have said something different about Hamas? No. It would not have been possible. A poll by The Economist and YouGov found this week that 22% of Democrats want to increase military aid to Israel, compared with 48% of Republicans. In contrast, 45% of Democrats want to increase humanitarian aid to Palestinians, compared with 8% of Republicans. Biden has proposed more than $14 billion in emergency aid to Israel, a move that is broadly supported within the House Democratic caucus. A separate national poll by Quinnipiac University found that 26% of Democrats disapprove of Biden's response to the war between Israel and Hamas, slightly higher than the 17% of Democrats who disapprove of his job performance overall. Among all voters, 42% approve of Biden's response to the conflict and 46% disapprove. Pelosi spoke at a breakfast organized by the Democratic group Third Way to discuss the political threat of a potential third-party bid by the group No Labels, which she said threatens Biden's re-election and the nation's future. Pelosi noted that House Democrats had previously voted to support an independent Palestinian state, and that a bill supporting the two-state solution would be likely to pass again if Republicans put it on the floor. She also reiterated her past criticism of the settlement policies of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I have gone to Israel time and again, as speaker and even before or as leader. I have always visited with the Palestinians. The only answer for peace there is to have a two-state solution, she said. We can't say what we don't believe, she added. We believe that 1,400 people were killed by Hamas, who is committed to the destruction of the State of Israel and is a terrorist organization, and cannot be allowed to do this again. Scott Clement contributed to this report.